You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive-compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 344 of the podcast. And in this one, I interview Courtney Newman, who's kindly agreed to share her story with us. And in particular, we talk about going to therapy, learning what OCD is, mental compulsions, harm worries around her family, COVID-related contamination worries, having a clean world and a dirty world, and so much more. And thank you to NoCD for supporting the podcast. NoCD offers affordable, effective, and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NoCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head over to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description. So thank you to Courtney for sharing her story. It was a pleasure to talk with her and hear her story. And thank you to you guys, as always, for listening. I deeply appreciate it. Without further ado, here is Courtney. Welcome to the podcast, Courtney.
Hi, nice to be here.
Yeah, it's good to have you on. So, as you know, I'd love to hear your story, so you can share that now in as little or as much detail.
Yeah, thank you. So I would generally say that my OCD story officially started rather recently. I was actually only diagnosed about a year ago. I was 25 at the time. And at that point, I had been going to therapy for about a year or two. I had been experiencing just anxiety and depression. I mean, I would generally say that I've always been a little bit of an anxious person, but at this point in time, I had moved to a new country recently. So I'm living in Germany now, which is where I moved to. I'm still living here, but I had moved here for my studies, and it was just a lot of change. I think my expectations for adjusting to this new place were quite high. So actually being here and living here and studying here, it was a lot of change at once, and I was having trouble more so than I would say I usually would. But luckily, I was able to find an English-speaking therapist, which was important for me. I'm not fluent in German, so that would have been a whole experience in and of itself. So I had been going to therapy for about a year or two. It was probably September, October, so maybe a little bit less than a year ago, I had realized I didn't know whether or not I had a diagnosis of any sort. So it took me a few sessions, but I eventually built up the courage to ask my therapist, hey, have you diagnosed me with anything? I'm just kind of curious. And of course, that's when she told me that she had diagnosed me with OCD. And specifically, she said that my anxiety and depression stems from having OCD. So they were very kind of interrelated, which I guess isn't a huge surprise. And I guess upon receiving this information, I felt super relieved. I was almost happy, you could say. Some of it didn't come as a huge surprise either. I had an idea of what OCD was. I mean, I definitely knew of some of the OCD stereotypes, and I could have assumed that I fit some of those. But I think at the time, I didn't really fully understand what OCD was, or what it could be, or how it could present itself. I didn't know that at the time, like I said, but I was just feeling kind of happy, okay, I have this diagnosis. I can, do what I need to do to get better and move on with my life. I think that's kind of how I was feeling at that point. And of course, I was curious to learn more about OCD. Like I said, I knew briefly about it, but not a lot. So I was okay, I want to know why I have it, all these different things. So I went into my kind of OCD exploration, resources online, social media, kind of looking for, I guess you could say, support groups, or trying to learn about other people's experience. I mean, of course, that's how I came across your podcast as well. OCD workbooks, the whole thing. And the more I kept digging into things, I slowly started to realize, wow, okay, I did not know what OCD was. I had this kind of stereotypical idea that I think most people would have. But one thing that really came as a surprise to me was learning about like mental compulsions, or like this kind of mental reviewing and rumination. Yeah, and just to give some quick context to that, a lot of my compulsions are not necessarily visible, or they're really easy to like hide or attribute to other things. And I can, I guess, talk about that more later. But essentially, it was like in this moment where I was like, oh, like there's so much that I didn't realize that was OCD. And kind of no wonder my therapist diagnosed me with this. And I remember even like in therapy sessions, I thought back to some conversations I had had with her where I would tell her like, yeah, I usually leave like an extra 10 minutes earlier than I need to so that I have time to go back and like check on the light switches and stuff. And at the time, like telling her this, like I didn't think anything of it. I was just like, oh yeah, I'm a little worried. I'm a bit anxious. And then like kind of thinking always back to it, I'm like, oh my God, like I told her very, like I spelled it out for her that I had OCD, which is kind of funny. But yeah, so I remember too, so I had been diagnosed and then I had gone back to the US to visit my family for the holidays shortly after. And again, I'm still kind of like exploring OCD. What is it? And I remember coming across this documentary series. I don't even remember what it's called, but it focused on a few different people, each with their own OCD experiences. And each video was like 10 minutes long. And I remember watching it and I was feeling really bad for these people. Like I could see how they were suffering and it made me feel so sad for them. And like I found myself like tearing up at different parts. And then a day or two went by and it kind of hit me like, oh my God, like I don't have the exact same, kind of OCD, the same compulsions that they may have. But that documentary could have just as easily been about me. And I think it was watching these people, because at that point I had only like read a lot of stuff, but like really seeing these people and like kind of listening to them and watching them like perform their compulsions and like all talk all about their OCD. I was like, oh, like shit, that could be me. And I was very, overwhelmed in that moment. I remember it was like a switch, kind of like I was kind of okay with having OCD. And now I'm like super depressed about having OCD. And like I said, at that point, I was at home in the US. So I wasn't like actively working with my therapist at this point, which probably like made the whole situation a bit worse. But it was probably the lowest I had ever been that I can like actively remember. And it was just this huge realization of like how serious my OCD was, and kind of realizing like, wow, my OCD really controls my life. It's like, it's in every thought, it's in all of my actions. I mean, like I said, a lot of my compulsions are not necessarily visible. So for me, it's a lot of mental reviewing, rumination. There's also a lot of checking, which I guess which is more visible, but I mean, everyone turns out a light switch, which I also do too. But, while I'm turning out the light switch, I'm also kind of checking in my head and, reviewing that process a lot. So again, a lot of checking, also checking like on people, on family and friends to make sure that they're okay. If I've had an intrusive thought somehow about something bad that may have happened to them. My mom driving home from work. Oh, I wonder, oh crap, what if she got in a car accident? And I can't just leave that thought alone. I need to make sure, hey, let me know when you're home. Are you okay? Checking on people. Definitely a lot of like avoiding things or places or activities to prevent anything that might be a trigger for my anxiety or any of my fears. And I would say also, I generally have sort of like this health OCD. But with COVID, I developed really bad contamination OCD. So of course, again, compulsions like mental reviewing and checking whether something I did could have given me COVID. But also, sanitizing everything when I get home, washing my hands, I change my clothes when I get home. And it's kind of like I live in two parallel worlds when it comes to my contamination OCD, kind of one that's clean and one that's dirty. Maybe we can talk more about that later, but just to kind of, follow up with my story. All to say is that essentially at this point, I was in like crisis mode. It was sort of a little identity crisis, if you will. Like I'm not just Courtney, I'm Courtney OCD. Like it's all one thing. And I felt like if I did learn to manage and like treat my OCD, that I wouldn't be who I am anymore. And I think something that I've come to learn though too, I mean, of course, like I don't like my compulsions. They're time consuming and energy consuming and all of these things. But I think in some ways having OCD isn't 100% a bad thing. Like I think for me anyways, like my OCD makes me a very caring and compassionate person. And so it kind of felt like, well, if I, learn to treat my OCD, what if I'm not actually a caring person? Like, what if I'm just an awful human to be around, So it kind of felt like an identity crisis. And somehow I was also extremely confused. Like, how is it possible that I've been doing all of these things seemingly my whole life, and it isn't actually normal? Like, I remember talking with my partner, like, hey, I was diagnosed with OCD and like, this is how it's presenting itself. Like, you don't do this? And, he's like, no. I'm like, oh my God. Like, to me, it was like crazy. Like, and I think I didn't know for so long that anything was wrong. Like, I feel like some people you'll listen to talk about their OCD and like there was something that happened or something that they do outwardly that they kind of see, okay, something's strange, like something's different. But for me, because so many of my compulsions were invisible, it was hard for me to ever see that anything was different. So, and I think about it too, like it's not unusual for somebody to say like, hey, I'm worried about this. What if this happens? Right? Like other people without OCD might say that. But I think what I didn't realize is that when people without OCD say that, that thought kind of just comes and goes. Whereas for me, someone who has OCD, I hold on to that thought like before it happens, while it's happening, and then I continue to like worry about it and check on it or whatever else after that event has taken place. And because I didn't like outwardly see anything different, it was hard for me to ever know that something was wrong. I guess you could say it like that. So somehow having OCD also, like getting that diagnosis and learning about it more, made it feel kind of unfair, like almost thinking about like how much easier would my life be if I didn't have all of this going on in my head constantly, because clearly other people don't have all of this going on in their head. So that felt kind of frustrating. And now I'm kind of at the point, I'm definitely still struggling with OCD treatment for a few different reasons. Maybe I'll stop there, but that's mostly my story.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, absolutely. We'll come back to, I'll make it, we'll come back to the treatment because it'd be good to hear that. But look, thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I think it's not common. I think it happens. Yeah. Some people where they've had OCD tendencies their whole kind of life, and especially if it's all internal or in the mind, that they don't have that epiphany of something's not quite right here. And
Yeah, and that's definitely what it was like. And sometimes it just feels, I mean, even now, like knowing what I know about myself and about people without OCD, sometimes I'm just like, how? Like, it just seems crazy to think that other people aren't experiencing this, because for me, it's just so normal. Like, I can't even tell you an exact time or event that would have like started this. I just feel like it's always been there. I mean, I guess I could, if I really thought hard enough, I could attribute it to a few different things, in my childhood or whatever, but it's just always felt so normal to me. And so realizing that it's not, or realizing kind of that there's like another way to live without all of these things. Yeah, it just felt unfair and frustrating.
Yeah, I hear that. Yeah, and now it's trying to figure out, well, what does that look like? What does living without it look like?
Yeah.
So, yeah, so in your childhood, I you don't actually have to go into it, but like how you feel now in your head, is that kind of, yeah, from a very young age, you now identify as OCD or?
To some extent, yes. I mean, yeah, I won't go into too much detail, but just to briefly explain. So, my parents divorced at a young age. My dad was in the military, so he was often busy. And I remember my mom having like health issues that she was dealing with. And I have two younger siblings that I grew up with. So, I was the oldest. Well, I am the oldest. That hasn't changed. But I just, I mean, I don't remember being like actively aware of it, but when I look back on my childhood, this is kind of how I think about it. Like there was a lot going on. And between me and my youngest sibling, it's only a 3-year difference. So we were all really young, like all at the same time. And, you know, kids can be crazy and cause a lot of stress. And I just remember like feeling like I didn't want to add to that burden in any way, or that I wanted to try and relieve some of that. So I think I was always in my head, like worried or thinking about like, how can I help? How can I avoid, adding to the stress? I mean, I remember one time, I must have been in like first or second grade. I had fallen at recess and I'd scraped up my knee and elbow like pretty bad. And I remember like hiding it from my parents when I got home. I got picked up from school and I didn't want to tell them that something had happened because I was so worried about like adding to their plate everything that was already going on. And I think that kind of as I've grown up, different things have happened that have just kind of continued that pattern or like allowed that pattern to continue. And I mean, even to this day, different circumstances between my mom and my dad, I just feel so on edge about what could happen or how can I make this situation easier, even though it's not my situation and it's not my life. Like I feel like I'm constantly thinking about other people, which, like I said before, is not always a bad thing. Like I think somehow to the other person who's on the receiving end of that, they might look at me and go, wow, she's so caring, so much empathy, all this kind of stuff. But for me, as much as I do it because I care, it consumes a lot of my energy, of course. And I think it also takes a lot away from, energy and time for myself, because by the time I'm like done kind of helping and checking on everybody for the day, I'm like totally exhausted and I just want to go to bed. So it leaves kind of less time for me and myself.
Absolutely, yeah. It's how can I still have those good qualities of caring, but also in a way that doesn't overwhelm me or exhaust me. Yeah, it's a tough one.
Yeah.
I'm curious on thank you for sharing that. I'm curious on the time difference. So, because you're in Germany, which is obviously an hour ahead of where I am, and then America is already like X hours behind me. How does that come into with the checking of like, is mom or dad okay?
Yeah. So, and my mom and dad live in different places, so it's actually different times also for them. But usually it's like 8 or 9 hours, I think. Sometimes I can't keep track. Wow. But yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because this is something that, especially since I've like moved abroad and been living abroad for so long, I think being here and not being closer to my family and being closer to just familiar things in general had kind of made my OCD more obvious, which is why I ended up in therapy in the first place when I got here. I still do it now sometimes, but I would say I'm better about it. But it would often be the case that I would leave my phone, for example, on loud when I go to bed because God forbid anything happened, because the time zones, like during their day, I'm sleeping, and God forbid anything happens, I would want to be able to be right at the phone and help in whatever way that I can. And that would disturb my sleep a lot. My phone's going off. And even if it wasn't, I mean, up to this point, it had never been anything serious, but like my phone is still going off. And it might just be my dad saying, hey, hope everything's good. But I don't know that. So I would check my phone. So it's a lot of like that kind of stuff where I'm kind of waiting for answers, or like I'll stay up. Like if I know that my mom is on her way home and I told her, like, please text me when you get home, it might be like 1 o'clock and I'm still waiting, like, hey, haven't gone to, I mean, not that I'm telling her this, but like, hey, I haven't gone to bed yet, but like, I just want to check and make sure everything's good before I go to sleep. Because I mean, if I didn't check, if I didn't know, it would be hard for me to sleep anyways. I have generally gotten better about turning my phone, like leaving the volume down when I go to bed, which is helpful, but that's kind of been a long time coming. So things like this. I mean, I think being away from my family in general makes it more difficult to be like active and aware of what's going on all the time. So it's just kind of this like looming stress and anxiety. Yeah, it's not easy. And like I said, that's kind of why part of the reason I think I ended up seeking out therapy kind of shortly after I got to Germany anyways, just because there was so much unfamiliar to me here in Germany, but also just being so far away from my family for so long was not easy. And I mean, it still isn't. It's never easy, but there was just a lot of kind of obsessions and compulsions that were having a field day when I first got here. So
yeah, understandably. And and with the time difference and the geographical distance, the mind's going to fill in those blanks, right? It's one thing you live in the same city or town, and okay, I know mum's probably roughly on her way home, but here you're like, it's just this big, I guess, chasm, not to use a dramatic word, but your mind's going to fill in all of that uncertainty, and then that's where the worries come in. Yeah, gosh. And do your parents know about your diagnosis?
Yeah, so when I had gone back to the US, so it would have been like November just last year. So shortly after my diagnosis, I did share with them that I was diagnosed with OCD. In like a weird way, I don't think it was a surprise to either of them, but I also know for a fact that their knowledge of OCD was similar to mine before I knew better. So, you know, sometimes it would be like, I don't know if the show Monk, I don't know if you've heard of it, where like he has OCD, and like, so my dad was, you know, I mean, trying to be nice, like he wasn't meaning it in any harm. He's like, oh, so you're like Monk. And I was like, well, like, not really, like my OCD is a lot different than that, you know? So I was like really trying to explain to them, like, you can't see what's going on so much. And that makes it more difficult, I think, for friends and family to like really understand, because it's really easy for me. Well, my compulsions aren't necessarily visible, but the ones that are, they're really easy for me to hide. So I think, and I do hide them if I feel like I need to, because, you know, sometimes they're embarrassing or they just make me feel crazy, right? So I think it was hard for my parents to like really, and even to this day, like for them to really understand like what it is on a day-to-day basis that I go through because of my OCD. And I think that really just boils down to all of the kind of lack of understanding and all of the stereotypes that OCD has, that it makes it difficult. I mean, not just for family and friends, but for anybody to really understand how OCD can be in reality.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And with your therapist, so your therapist is in Germany?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, cool. And I guess they're a German native, but they speak English or they.
So, yeah, I assume she's German native, but she offers her therapy in German and in English. So it's not just like, oh, I speak English. She really offers it in
Okay,
English. Like that's how it's advertised.
okay, brilliant.
Yeah.
Um, and you mentioned two worlds earlier that you
Mhm.
kind of live in. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so this is in relation specifically to my contamination OCD, which a lot of that started mostly with COVID.
Hmm.
Like I said, I'd always kind of had a bit of like health OCD related issues, but my contamination OCD specifically started with COVID. It came on kind of gradually. Um, and I almost like don't even remember it starting. I just
Hmm.
feel like it was there one day and it just kept happening. But yeah, I have always kind of since COVID, like sanitizing when I get home, washing my hands, changing my clothes when I get home. There'd be like kind of like hoarding, I guess you could say, of like self tests and masks and sanitizers that like I didn't even realize how much I had, but it just, those were so critical for me to like stay safe. But essentially, like I think of these two worlds. So like for me, I call it my dirty world is like when I'm outside, and my clean world is like in my apartment. And actually, when I'm outside in the dirty world, like fully immersed in it, I'm relatively okay. I can use my phone and, sit on a bench that's outside. Like I can do things and I'm relatively okay. There's maybe certain things in the dirty world when I'm in the dirty world that are still a little bit kind of triggering. But the biggest issues I have is when this clean world and this dirty world start to collide. So, like, I come home and I was just in my dirty world, and then I come home, I enter this sort of threshold into my clean world, and that's when I'm really not okay. Um, yeah, like I said, all those kind of compulsions, like sanitizing, all those come into immediate effect. There's like a whole routine of exactly in what order and how I have to sanitize and wash my hands and change my clothes. Like there's a whole process to it. And then once everything in my clean world is also clean again, I'm okay. Of course, because at the beginning of COVID, I was living on my own. So it was just me and my apartment. It was really easy to like let these two worlds be separate from each other. And then partway through COVID, my boyfriend was living with me. And then it's kind of when I realized what was happening, or like, oh, something's weird. Because he would come home, and this was before I was diagnosed too. So I didn't think anything of what was going on. But he would get home and I'd be like, oh, can you sanitize your phone? Oh, wash your hands. Oh, don't sit on the bed. Like, not unless you change your clothes. Like, there was like kind of like all these restrictions, like on what he could or couldn't do. And I always kind of joked like, oh, well, like it's my apartment. So like, if I'm asking you to do that, like, just please do that. And he'd be annoyed about it, but he would generally just do it and it was fine. Well, now fast forward, we're living together. And it was a big topic of conversation with my therapist. Like, well, what are you going to do when you live together? Like, and this is now I'm diagnosed with OCD, but he's allowed to exist in his apartment. You can't force him to like clean and sanitize and do all these things. Not that I should have been doing it before. I just didn't know better at the time, right? But it's been difficult to say the least. Because I come home, I still do all my sanitizing, changing my clothes, whatever. And he just continues existing the second he walks in the door. But then what started happening too, and I guess this started before also, but I noticed it more now that we're living together, is like I am so aware of like where he sets his phone. And then now that phone was, whatever, on the kitchen table. And I'm like, oh, okay, don't touch that part of the kitchen table, right? Like, Because then if I touch that part of the kitchen table, now I'm dirty and I have to go wash my hands again. And sometimes, frankly, I'm tired of washing my hands. So it's like avoiding many things all at the same time. And then at some point when the avoiding all of the spots, because I've been like tracking and remembering where he sat, what he touched, all this kind of stuff. When I'm tired of doing that, I'll just go around and sanitize everything, because then I can just like have a clean slate. Like it's getting hard to remember. If I just go clean, then everything's fine. So that has been kind of difficult, just because it's not really an option for me to 100% keep my clean and dirty world separate now that I'm living with someone. So yeah, it's somehow intriguing. Like it's really interesting how like when I am in my dirty world, like I said, I'm relatively okay. There's been ups and downs even within that, but compared to when I'm like at that threshold, I'm really relatively relaxed in my dirty world. And I think that is something that is even hard for like my therapist to fully understand. Because it's just like two parallel universes sometimes. It's really strange.
Yeah, it is. And what does what does home mean to you?
Ugh.
Not to therapize you.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, because I have thought about this. Like,
yeah.
I would say home is like the place I know and can trust that I have control over. I mean, because my therapist has also asked me before, sort of like, well, what if you go to like a hotel? Like, what happens then? Because it's like where you're staying. And I'm like, yeah, like I do okay in hotels. Like I still sanitize like everything in the hotel when I arrive, but then I'm like kind of okay.
Yeah.
And it's weird too, because like even if I go over to a friend's house, like to me that world is still dirty. So I won't sanitize my phone when I go to their house, but I'll kind of live rather comfortably or like exist in their apartment as I would in my own apartment. And so sometimes like my logical brain is always like, what are you doing? Like coming home and sanitizing everything. Like it shouldn't be a concern, but it's just something that like my OCD brain tells me like, you need to be worried about it. You need to make sure you do something about it. And it's so hard to just not give into those. Because in a weird way, like it's so easy to just be like, yeah, but if I just do this, like, oh, it'll take, 1 or 2 minutes. Like I'm so good at this routine at this point, like it won't take me long. Then I'm like free of the stress and anxiety. And I mean, of course, that's exactly what OCD wants you to do, right? Like that's exactly the cycle. And like, it's annoying because like I see myself doing it so often, not just with contamination OCD, but with a lot of different kind of my subtypes of OCD. Like I see it happening and it's just so hard to not do it. And it gets so frustrating because it's like, I know better, or like, I know I turned out that light. Like, why am I still thinking about it? Why am I still worried about it? But yeah, really like having to sit with that is really hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, that's the kind of trap of OCD. It kind of sells you that lie of you'll be safe if you just do this little thing, not knowing all those little things add up to a lot. And of course, the way to be safe is to do none of it, at least from an OCD point of view. I'm sure some of it has helped with COVID protection, but but
the funny thing is, I actually ended up getting COVID back in June, and it was weird because I had been with my therapist in May, and I remember telling her like, I mean, she already knew this, but I remember being like, I'm so afraid of getting COVID, like obviously, right? Like that's why I've been doing everything that I've been doing. And she asked me, she was like, Courtney, what would happen if you got COVID? And I was like, I don't know. That's the problem. Like, I don't know what would happen. Like, I'd like to think I'm healthy. I'm young. I should be okay. I said, but to be honest, more than even being however sick I might be, I feel like I'm just going to be angry and like ashamed. And lo and behold, like a month later, I get COVID and I was pretty sick, I have to say, which sucked. But I was just angry, like the whole time having COVID. I was so angry. I was embarrassed. I was ashamed. Like, I've done all of these compulsions and all of these, sanitizing crazy things to avoid getting COVID. I've been so judgmental of everybody else who's gotten COVID, like judging everybody else's actions or inactions or whatever. I've been so judgmental. Meanwhile, here I am with COVID, and I like didn't know how to feel, but angry and like ashamed. Like, I just felt, how did I end up here? Like, I did so much and more to not get COVID, yet here I am. Like, this is unfair. And I think the other thing that really was frustrating is, I mean, like, certain people in my life are aware of my contamination OCD. Like, obviously my partner is, like, he watches me do it all the time. And everyone kept saying things to me like, oh, well, now that you've had COVID, now you don't have to worry so much about getting COVID anymore. And like, I had, somebody asked me like, well, now that you've had COVID, do you think you'll keep like sanitizing and all this stuff? And I was like, I was just annoyed by the question. And part of me was like, okay, Courtney, like, now that you've had COVID, you don't need to worry anymore. And then I finally tested negative. I go out into the world. I'm fine in my outside world. I come home and it was like, like, what do I do? Like, it was so confusing for me. Like, I already had COVID. Do I need to sanitize? Like, it was very confusing. Unfortunately, I still find myself sanitizing and changing my clothes and these kinds of things when I get home. But I would generally say, I think I mentioned it briefly, but I also did a lot of like reviewing of like what I did when I went out to like make sure like whatever I did wouldn't have given me COVID. And that has stopped a lot. I mean, I guess just by chance. It's not like I was actively trying to overcome that. But at least there's a little bit kind of a release there in that sense that that's not as strong as it used to be.
Yeah, good to hear. But yeah, well, your outside or dirty world, maybe it's, and with like going to your friends and stuff like that, I guess the brain knows it can't control that environment, so it probably just, well, I can't do anything about it, so what's the point? Because our brain ultimately, by making you anxious, is just trying to keep you safe.
Yeah.
So it's learning, probably is my prediction, that, well, I can't control this environment, so giving her anxiety isn't going to help her because she can't do anything to keep herself safe. Obviously, you can in terms of masks and stuff, and avoid people coughing and all that good stuff. But yeah, so maybe it just relaxes, and then when you get into the environment you have 100% control over, it's like, okay, game time. We can keep her safe. Let's make her anxious.
And even when I was home in the US, I ended up being home for like 2.5 or 3 months. And again, this was like shortly after my OCD diagnosis. And I remember like because I was living at the time, like either I was at my dad's house or my mom's house. And like, those were places I didn't have control over necessarily, but I was still fully living there. Like, it wasn't like a hotel, like I was just there for a day or two. And that was really hard for me too, because like my dad would want to show me something on his phone, and like, I know he didn't sanitize his phone, so it was like a lot of this tracking again. Like, there was only certain parts of the house that I could set my phone down when I was in the living room or whatever, because I had never seen anybody else like use that section. I mean, I even like if we were all watching TV, like I sat on the floor because they all were always in their dirty clothes sitting on the sofa. And I was like, I don't know where else I'm supposed to sit. Like, because otherwise in my clean clothes, I'm going to sit where their dirty clothes were. And now I have to go into my bedroom, and now I'm going to get that dirty. So it was like constantly just like tracking. It was really exhausting. I mean, not that I would ever, miss a chance of being with my family, like in a weird way, it's totally worth it. But like, it was exhausting, like being at home in a place that I didn't have control over necessarily.
Yeah, that is interesting. And what was I going to say on that? Yeah, you mentioned earlier on that you're stuck in a couple areas of therapy. What are those, if you're okay to share?
Yeah, I mean, in general, to say just in general, okay. I think just the idea of going through treatment is scary. I mean, I'll also preface by saying it's been difficult to find like an OCD specialist here in Germany who's also English speaking. So I mean, of course, I'm very thankful for my therapist, but I'm really also just like working with what I have and trying to make the most of that. But I would really say that treatment in general has been difficult to fully commit to.
Okay.
I think because a lot of my compulsions are invisible to others, treatment seems especially scary because it seems very isolating. Like it's completely up to me to get better. I mean, like, of course, I know it's my responsibility anyways, but it's so hard to get support when it's also easy for me to hide my OCD, not just from others, but even sometimes from myself. And so in some ways, it kind of feels like I'm just settling to literally avoid doing the hard thing that is treatment. And I think sometimes also like knowing that I've lived with this for so long, so much of it does seem so familiar. Not to say that it's easy and not to say that it's not exhausting, but it's just so familiar that sometimes it's just easier to accept living with it and letting it just kind of exist as opposed to facing all of the anxiety and the fears head on. I mean, anyone who's gone through OCD treatment knows it's not easy. And I think just, knowing that has led to a bigger avoidance than I would sometimes like to admit, which of course just leaves me feeling like really guilty about not being ready to fully commit to it. So I would say it's nothing like specific about treatment. It's just kind of like treatment as an idea.
Yeah, well, you got to, trust yourself and know when the time is right. And I get the guilt. Again, it comes back to whenever you're ready, right? And ERP can be quite tough. At times, it can also be surprisingly simple and easy. I have clients that I work with that they've been, they've not. I don't want to give any specific examples away. They've not done something for like a year, for example. Gone somewhere or gone in a particular room in their house, for example. They haven't done it for a year. And then when we talk about it and we set a target of, okay, this week, just try and get near the door, see what happens. You don't have to go through it. Use the skills we've done and then walk through if you feel ready, or run through it if you have to the first time. And they do it and they come back and like, oh yeah, I've been through the door like 20 times this week, never having gone through it in the last year because it's been so scary in their mind. And it was surprisingly easy for them. So sometimes ERP is very much like, sometimes it is, you go through the door and you're having a panic attack or it's scary, and then sometimes actually it was absolutely fine. It was just the perceived threat that it was going to be difficult. And so it's not always torture. It should never be torture, I should say. But you know what I mean? It's sometimes we can surprise ourselves.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that some things have gotten better almost because like they had to. So just to give an example, like when COVID was really bad, I never used the public transportation, and that's my main way of getting around here. So I would literally walk hours a day to like get to my therapy appointment or go run my errands. Like I was wasting my time. Like I would walk 4 or 5 hours a day to get to where I needed to be. And I was relatively central in my previous apartment. Now, I mean, I'm still very well connected, but it's not as easy to walk places. So I was essentially forced, if you will, to like use public transportation to get to the places that I needed to go. And it was exactly, I mean, kind of like you described, maybe it wasn't like active, right? But like I got on the subway and was like, oh, like I'm a little tense. I'm still a little anxious, but I'm on the subway. Like I did it. And now, sometimes I'll still be a little anxious. Like if people aren't wearing their masks, like that's something that really stresses me out, but like I can do it. And so maybe it's not active necessarily, but some things, at least by chance, have gotten better, let's say.
Yeah, but that's a good example. Yeah, how it's like a metaphor is like we're standing at the edge of this dark cave, right? We're looking
Yeah.
in. It's scary. We don't know what's in there, and
Yeah.
we walk in, and it could be a fire-breathing dragon, and that's okay. We need to slay it at that point. Or the other one is you could walk in and it's Bambi, and
Yeah.
but we didn't know it was a dark, scary cave. So yeah, so you going on the subway, your brain learned, oh, it wasn't. I'm tense, scary, but it wasn't as bad as I predicted.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah. I mean, the other thing to share is, I know what you're saying. It's that the saying, "Better the devil you know," came to my mind. Of with OCD, it's okay. It's annoying, but actually, I've mastered my rituals and I've done so well so far.
Yeah.
You're a successful young woman, like so. But it's what could you do without OCD? And not even what could you do. How could you be? The freedom you'd feel and just be able to come into your flat and just put your
Yeah.
feet up and it, it's yeah, it's
Yeah.
keeping that in mind as well, because otherwise we forget that and we put it off of
Yeah.
like
I
I'm
think,
managing.
yeah. I think something that I've also kind of related to that or going off of that is like I'm a very restrictive person. So there's a lot of things that I normally just chuck it up to like, oh, I don't like doing that, or like, that's not my favorite thing to do. So I just won't do it. But the more, especially now that I've been in therapy and been in a safer setting to like evaluate these things, a lot of these like restrictions that I have are really me just like avoiding things to avoid some sort of fear. So, like I mentioned, I have a lot of like health and like checking type OC as well. Like I hate being in the sun. And like, I always just said, I even said it now, like I hate being in the sun. I don't like being warm, which also to me in my brain, I associate with the sun. Like I don't like being in the sun because I'm afraid of getting cancer. So to avoid getting cancer, I just don't go in the sun. And I think it's taken me a long time, and it's something that I'm still working with to like really look at like all of these so-called like restrictions or all of these like dislikes that I have and really evaluate them. Like, is this actually something that I don't like, or am I just afraid of it for some reason? And I think kind of like you said, it's become so normal for me to like not like things or avoid things that I don't even always realize like when OCD is actually playing a role in things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, figure out what's OCD and what's everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if you live with it a long time, it's hard to know. It takes
Yeah.
time to figure out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So if anyone listening, any words of hope you have for them around OCD?
Oh, I don't know if it's specific to OCD, but maybe just kind of anxiety, depression, OCD in general. And I don't even know who said it or where it came from originally, but it says something like, you've survived all the hardest days of your life so far, so you can get through this and like just keep going. It says something like that. I probably butchered it a little bit, but I think in general, especially, this past holiday season when I really wasn't doing well, it was just a good reminder of like knowing that I'm capable of so many things, even when things seem so impossible and so bad, that I've already done a lot of hard things before. And a lot of good days have come since then. So
yeah, brilliant. Spot on. Yeah, I like that one. Okay, so let's say you can pick up the phone and call the 20-year-old. No, let's change that.
yeah, that wasn't too long ago.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. The 16-year-old you, what would you tell her?
So thinking back to when I was 16, I was in high school. I would say I was generally very, uptight, anxious, very rule following, all of these kinds of things. I think not that I still struggle with these things now, but maybe if I had started listening to my own advice earlier, it would have made a difference. But I would have wanted to tell that 16-year-old Courtney something like, let life be fun and don't be so serious. And probably like you deserve to enjoy things and not be worried all the time.
Yeah, I like that. And that same advice could apply to 25, 26,
26-year-old. Yeah, it still applies now.
Yeah.
But maybe it would have made a difference had I known years before. I don't know.
Yeah, good point. Okay, and you've got a billboard in Germany. What do you want written on that billboard?
Oh,
It can be anything.
I know this is a question you ask, and I still feel unprepared for it. Maybe I'll just steal from my previous answer, but kind of just let life be fun. Enjoy it. Yeah.
Yeah, I like it. And then lastly, is there anything else you wish you could have said or shared today?
Well, I mean, there's probably always something, but I think we covered a good bit, and I'm just happy that I had this opportunity to talk to you and hope that, you know, something I said is resonating with somebody in some way.
Yeah, no doubt it will do. And look, thank you so much for sharing your story. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us with a one-time tip/donation, please go to theocdstories.com/support. All tips, no matter how large or small, are greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/theocdstories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.